so you can play.
Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and this is the very first episode of Shadows in the Warp, a show that I'm creating fully dedicated to the Tyranids in the Warhammer 40k universe. And I thought, what better way to start off this series than to talk about the basics of the Tyranids and why I love playing them. Because if you don't play Tyranids and you're thinking of starting another race, or maybe you don't play 40k at all and you're thinking of starting it and you want to choose which race you want to do, I want to tell you why I absolutely love the Tyranids and why they have remained, after 6 or 7 years of playing 40k, my favorite, even though I've tried out other armies, which I've liked, just not as much as the Tyranids. So first, a little background on the Tyranids. So who are the Tyranids? Well, the Tyranids are an intergalactic species that have started to invade our galaxy. Now this is a unique thing because every other race, as far as we know, is from this galaxy. A lot of them created by the old ones themselves. But the Tyranids have actually come from another galaxy, which is, if you know anything about the universe, is a rather amazing feat, because the distance between galaxies is huge. You think the distance between stars is big, and it is. The distance between galaxies makes the stars look like they're next door neighbors, and that's where the Tyranids are from. They're from another galaxy. We don't know anything about it, really. I'm not sure how much Games Workshop even has decided that they know about it, but really all we know is that they've come, and we don't know why. Have they come because they consumed several other galaxies? I've heard people say that they've consumed several galaxies and now they're just coming for another one to eat. Or are they fleeing some greater predator, as the Tyranid Codex says that might be a case? We don't know. But they are here and they are hungry. So throughout this whole thing, they travel as a hive fleet, or several hive fleets. We see them coming into our galaxy in different splinters or different entire fleets that seem to operate independent of each other. They even have different colors and different adaptations and different strategies. And so it's hard to know if all of these hive fleets are part of one great whole, or whether they really are a bunch of splinter of the same species that kind of gets a local hive mind, as we will see what that is. The hive mind is a collection of the psychic essence of all the Tyranid creatures. And these creatures range from a tiny ripper swarm that has no independence and just has like a singular goal, and that is to consume and destroy, all the way up to the mighty hive tyrants, who actually can almost act a little independently. Not that they have a independent will or their own characteristics, but more that they've been delegated. Their brains and their psychic essence is enough that they can kind of adapt without waiting for instruction from the larger hive mind. Because even though this is one big interlinked hive mind, they still have to act somewhat locally as well in the synapse web that they do have. And so with this whole synapse web, we get what's called the Shadow in the Warp, hence the title of this web series. And the Shadow in the Warp, what it is if you understand what the Warp is, the Warp, of course, is the collection of all the psychic essence of humans and other races. And so demons and even the Chaos Gods are really just a manifestation of the emotions of humans and Eldar and orcs and other ones. Not necessarily, as far as I know, the Tau and Necrons don't really have that presence, but I'm not 100% sure on all of that. However, when the Tyranids approach, you feel what's called a Shadow in the Warp, and that's where it's just a smothering effect. And anytime a Psyker tries to tap into the Warp to communicate or to use psychic abilities, they all of a sudden can hear the voices of billions of organisms all at once, and it makes it very hard to navigate the Warp. It makes it very hard to use psychic abilities, and so it really smothers all of that. And then what this does is it isolates worlds, because the Imperium uses the Warp to travel. And they have the beacon of the Emperor that allows them to be guided, but then when they get near a Tyranid fleet, that beacon gets smothered and they can't see where they're going. Quite literally, the navigators on board the ships can't really sense where they're going properly, and so they get steered off course, and it's hard to really get to the destination. So typically, once a hive fleet has arrived at your system, you're all alone, and whatever you have is all you've got left to defend against that, which is a very, very difficult foe unless you're like a Space Marine founding world and have, or a Forge world and have all the mechanisms to do that. It's going to be a very difficult fight. And they are basically a destroyer of worlds. In the second video that'll be in the vault at the link description below, I'm going to talk about how they actually consume a world, all the phases of the invasion and how that all works together. But we're not going to talk about that right now. Just know that they destroy entire worlds, they feed on it, and then they move on to find even more worlds. So why do I love Tyranids? Well, yeah, I have to admit the very first reason that I got into them was because before I got into Warhammer 40k, I played a lot of StarCraft, the original StarCraft and Brood War. And the Zerg was my favorite race. I just loved the terrifying nature of just a swarm of alien creatures overrunning gun lines and just being a rather general menace and a really good villain. I've always enjoyed a good villain. All growing up, I've been dungeon master and games master for role-playing games and role-playing groups. And even just playing with my brothers, I'd always play the villain who is really hard to overcome, but then you eventually defeat it. So I've always been drawn to that side, which might sound funny that I'm being drawn to the side of evil or of the villains. But I like when the villains get beat. I just like when it's really hard to beat them. I enjoy that kind of story. And the Tyranids, to me, offer the ultimate villain. Because in the end, something that you can't make afraid is terrifying. If you think about that, like what is the easiest way for you to get confidence against a villain? Well, it's that you make him afraid. And we like seeing that in some of our movies. We like watching the hero all of a sudden make the villain really afraid after all this time the villain seeming impervious. But you can't do that with the Tyranids. They don't have a singular creature who is controlling everything that if you kind of challenge it and say, I'm going to be bigger than you and stronger than you, and it gets afraid and tries to run away. They don't. They don't have any concept of that. They just work as this huge organism. Really, you can compare it to our digestive system. When you eat a piece of food and it goes into your stomach, that food is getting eaten by everything else. Or you're fighting off an infection in your bloodstream. The blood doesn't get afraid of the infection, it just does its job. The infection fights back. Just as the Imperium of Man and Eldar and Orcs and Tau and Necrons fight back against the Tyranids, but the blood cells in our immune system it's not even really aware that it's fighting back. It's just doing its function. And that's what the Tyranids are like. They just do their function. They're just going out and eating, and sometimes the food bites back and they've got to chomp down a little bit more here or sharpen their knife so they can cut through that tomato over there a little better. And that's it. So how do you defeat an enemy that doesn't submit to what you are so used to using as tactics? Because most wars, when you look at most wars fought between man and all the aliens and Xenos races in the galaxy in Warhammer 40k, they're not won by completely and utterly destroying the enemy. They are won by beating them to the point that they withdraw or that they run away. When you're fighting a battle, you don't have to destroy every last thing. You have to just destroy enough of them that the rest of them are afraid and run away, and then you can track them down and hunt them down and kill them. But the Tyranids don't act like that. If they do withdraw, you have to kind of worry about their intent, because it's not just a tactical withdrawal, it's actually just their organism being like, okay, just kind of move over here and we'll adapt this thing, and then bam, we're back and we're hitting a weak point, or we're going to undermine your defenses here. And that's how they work. So if you destroy the synapse, then you do get the individual creatures like the Gaunts and the Ripper Swarms who kind of lose their link to the hive mind, and they revert to their instinctual behaviors, which might be to hide or to feed or to hunt. But in the end, even those creatures, then you're just fighting dogs and wolves, and that's just, it's just not satisfying in that sense, which is why I think that they're so awesome. And so they are super intelligent, they're adaptable, but in such an alien way that sometimes it's hard for us to fathom how they can do that. We have our tactics, we look for weak points, we do reconnaissance and all that kind of stuff, and they do all of that as well, but just in a way that it's like your hand closing over something. You don't actually think about each individual finger. You just close your hand over the thing. Well, that's the Tyranids. They don't think about each individual finger, they just do. This is the hive mind. It's just clenching over an entire world, consuming it, and leaving it a barren wasteland. Now, in terms of the actual game of Warhammer 40k, the Tyranids have advantages and disadvantages. They have strengths and weaknesses. Competitively, they're not a top-tier army. Now, people, if they get really good at them, they could go to tournaments and have certain lists that might be able to perform well. but they're no Eldar or Tau or Grey Knights. They're not one of the top tier armies. But for me, that's never been a draw to any of these games. Tournament play, I quickly learned, was not my thing. Even though I love the tactics and the strategies, going to tournaments, I just found that it just wasn't the right environment for playing. I preferred to play for fun. Still trying to beat the snot out of my opponent, of course, but doing it in a way that would be a lot more fun than bringing some sort of cheesy list. So in the meta, they're not super competitive. The other disadvantage is that they don't really play like their fluff or the lore would indicate. In the lore, you get lots of little creatures swarming and then bigger creatures kind of supporting those little creatures. Well, when you play, if you want to play competitively, you often will use a lot of big creatures with maybe some little creatures. There are competitive lists that use kind of what the lore indicates, but a lot of the new codex stuff has kind of pushed towards the bigger creatures and the bigger organisms and really focusing on those. And that's fun, I like the variety, but it doesn't quite go with the lore, which is why I love using them in narrative campaigns, because then I can go back to how they actually act in the lore. Now, what I love about them though is the diversity that they do employ, that there are so many different ways to play Tyranids, and to play them even semi-competitively, not like tournament competitive, so that's gone. I'm not even gonna really worry about that, but I'm talking semi-competitively. You know, when your opponent isn't bringing a cheesy list, there's a lot of different ways you can play them. You can play a monstrous creature list where there's just lots of big guys. In fact, you can play without a single small based model, because even Battleforged, like forgetting Unbound, but with Battleforged in 7th edition, you can still play without a single small based model, because your troop choices, you have access to warriors. And warriors are your medium based monsters, and they're quite powerful. You can play with a Tervigon spawning spam lists, where you can actually, and I'm talking about Battleforged here, I'm not talking about Unbound. Like, you can do anything in Unbound, but there's disadvantages there. But you can have 3 or 4 or 5 Tervigons who just spawn tons of Termagants, and you can have tons of fun with that, because, you know, it's not necessarily the most competitive, but it's just fun to watch and see them all go out there, and then the Tervigons themselves are psychers and get to cast some abilities. You could have a flying monstrous creature list where there's just tons of stuff in the sky, and then they're backed up with gargoyles and Tyranid shrikes, and all the stuff that you're just clogging the skies, and you get to have that kind of fun. You could have a huge swarm army. While they're not the biggest swarm army, I think the orcs, in my opinion, are the swarmiest of swarm armies. The Tyranids actually have the ability to have more models on the table if you really wanted to. For example, in a Battleforged list, you could have 180 Termagants with those 6 troop choices. And those 180 Termagants, unupgraded, only cost you 720 points. That's not even half the points of a 1,500 point list. Think of that, 180 models on the table. How is your opponent, no matter how much firepower they have, going to destroy that many guys? It'll be a lot of work for them, and it's a lot of fun just to watch those swarms go across, see huge explosions, and you're removing them by the droves, and it's just great. It's just great fun. Or you can have the deep striking list where the Trigons and the Molochs and the Raveners and all, they pop up out of the ground to disrupt the defenses in the back. There's just so many options that the Tyranids do have. And I think that that's what makes them fun, is that they have this adaptive biology. You can create your own hive fleet with its own name and with its own backstory, and it can be completely independent of everything else that's been there, and they can have really cool things that happen. Or you could just create one that's from the book. There's lots of different hive fleets that have already been introduced with all their color schemes and everything, and the fights that they fought and the fights that they're currently fighting. But in the end, the Tyranids are terrifying. They could potentially be one of the biggest threats this galaxy has ever seen. I know that Chaos is usually looked at that way, and Chaos is a big threat. But since we don't know truly how big the Tyranid hive fleet is, that is why they could be the end of the galaxy for every race out there. So that's the end of this episode. So why don't you go ahead and click on the link below to go and watch episode number 2, which is already ready and up in the vault. In that episode, I am going to be detailing how a Tyranid hive fleet moves in, invades, and consumes an entire world. Special thanks to all those who have submitted images. Of course, you've seen exactly where those images are from that you've seen in this video. So thank you very much for those. I think that they're fantastic. Some of the pictures are just absolutely breathtakingly awesome. So thank you very much for that. And of course, I'd love your suggestions on what you'd like to see on this show. We're going to be doing all sorts of stuff. We're going to be doing tactics. We're going to be doing more lore. We're going to talk about rules and everything. So any ideas that you have, go ahead and post a comment in the links, or in the comment section below. And as always, thanks for watching, and happy wargaming.